That afternoon, the sky over Cincinnati hung heavy with gray clouds, as if threatening rain but never quite delivering. The air carried the scent of damp pavement mixed with grease from nearby fast food stands, a blend of the city's energy and its quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved through the streets in their usual rhythm. Some walked with purpose, eyes fixed on their destinations, while others wandered aimlessly, lost in thought. It was the kind of day where the city felt both alive and indifferent all at once. JD Vance walked at a steady pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did he have an entourage trailing behind him, just another man blending into the city's pulse. Yet, even in his casual attire, he wasn't entirely unnoticed. A few people stole glances, whispering among themselves. Some recognized him from television, others from newspaper headlines. His name carried weight, even if, at this moment, he was just another passerby weaving through the aging storefronts and abandoned scooters littering the sidewalks. Then a voice cut through the urban noise. "Hey, man, can you spare $1?" Vance slowed his step. The man standing before him wasn't old, but time had worn him down in ways that made him seem older than he likely was. He was thin, not just the kind of thin that comes from missing meals, but the kind that settles into a person's face, hollowing their cheeks, making their eyes seem too large. His clothes were layered, mismatched, chosen for survival rather than style. His beard was patchy, more neglected than intentional, and his hands, cracked from exposure, remained buried in the pockets of his oversized jacket. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't insistent, just standing there, waiting, as if he had asked this question 1,000 times before and expected nothing in return. Vance didn't immediately reach for his wallet. Instead, he studied the man for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. A single dollar. It was a small request, one he had heard countless times before. Usually, people either dropped a bill into an outstretched palm or simply kept walking. But something about this man, about the quiet way he asked, made Vance hesitate. He met the man's eyes and asked a question that the man clearly wasn't expecting. "What's your name?" Eddie hesitated, blinking as if the question had caught him off guard. He wasn't used to this, being asked his name, being seen as anything more than just another man on the street. For too long he had lived in the shadows of the city, blending into the background like the cracked pavement beneath his feet. People usually avoided eye contact, dropped a coin or two, and walked away before he could say thank you. But JD Vance was still standing there, waiting for an answer. After a moment, Eddie muttered his name, barely audible over the hum of the city. His voice was rough, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent too many nights out in the cold, too many days speaking only to himself. Vance nodded slightly, acknowledging the name as if it mattered. The streets around them carried on, indifferent to the exchange. A few people had started to slow their steps, their curiosity piqued. A man leaned against a lamppost, pretending to check his phone. A woman with a grocery bag lingered a few feet away, her ears tuned in. Eddie knew the routine. People loved a spectacle, especially one involving a politician and a homeless man. Eddie shifted his weight, his shoulders slumping slightly. The exhaustion in his posture was not just from lack of sleep, but from something deeper, the kind of weariness that settled into a man's bones after years of fighting battles he knew he couldn't win. His clothes were a mismatched collection of jackets and shirts, layered together, not for style, but for survival. His hands, cracked and dry from exposure, curled inside the sleeves of his coat, gripping at nothing. Vance's voice cut through the moment, steady and calm. He asked how long Eddie had been out there. Eddie let out a short breath, a laugh without humor. Too long. Long enough to stop keeping track. Long enough to understand that, in a city like this, a man like him was invisible until someone decided he wasn't. He had worked once, a decent job. Residential plumbing, fixing leaks, replacing water heaters. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills, kept food on the table. Then life had unraveled. One bad month turned into 2, then 6, and suddenly the rent wasn't getting paid. Then the job was gone. Then the apartment, then the phone. And once those things disappeared, getting them back was nearly impossible. Eddie had tried. He'd stood in lines outside shelters, only to be told they were full. He'd walked into businesses asking for work, only to hear the same thing: come back when you have a phone, an address, a way for us to reach you. But those things required money, and money required work. It was a cycle, a trap he hadn't found a way out of. Vance listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change, no pity, no judgment, just listening. The small crowd around them had grown, people watching, some waiting for Eddie to say something profound, others expecting Vance to pull out his wallet and end the exchange with a few dollars. But Vance didn't move to do that. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out, wordlessly. Eddie eyed it with suspicion. He had seen too many of these pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions, flyers for shelters that were already overflowing, numbers to call that led nowhere. But something in Vance's expression made him pause. It wasn't a sales pitch, and it wasn't charity. It was something different. The paper held a name, a number, a connection, a chance. Vance explained. There was a program, Housing First, no strings, a place to start. Eddie's fingers twitched, but he didn't take the paper right away. Around him, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone scoffed. Someone muttered that it was all for show. Another voice cut in, sharp and dismissive, claiming that men like Eddie never changed, that he'd waste the opportunity like all the others. Eddie clenched his jaw. He had heard those words before, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from himself. His eyes flicked to the paper again. He could feel its weight before he even touched it. Not heavy in his hands, but heavy in what it represented. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a miracle. It was a door, cracked open just enough for him to step through if he wanted to. Finally, his fingers curled around the paper. His grip was hesitant at first, then firmer, as if afraid it might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. A few feet away, someone scoffed again, muttering about how $1 would have been easier, but Vance didn't acknowledge them. His focus remained on Eddie. A job, a real shot, something more than just another meal, another night spent trying to make it until morning. Eddie had spent so long convincing himself that this was it, that life didn't hand men like him second chances. But now, holding that piece of paper, he had to wonder, was that true? Was he willing to find out? Eddie stared at the folded piece of paper in JD Vance's hand. He had seen things like this before, well-meaning handouts that led nowhere, numbers for programs with waiting lists months long, addresses for shelters already at capacity. He had learned the hard way that promises, no matter how sincere, didn't always lead to solutions. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for it. The air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered continued to grow. Vance remained steady, his hand still outstretched. He wasn't pushing, wasn't pleading, just waiting. Eddie let out a short breath, a scoff more than a laugh. "And what exactly is this supposed to do for me?" His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the weight of someone who had been let down too many times to believe in easy solutions. "It's a name," Vance said simply. "A number. Someone who can help." Eddie shook his head, the skepticism in his eyes hardening. "Ain't that easy?" "No," Vance admitted. "It's not. But it's real." Eddie rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers dragging across his rough stubble. The exhaustion that never truly left him settled deeper into his bones. He wanted to believe that it could be that simple, that a folded piece of paper could be the key to something better, but he had spent years watching hope flicker out just as quickly as it sparked, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to go through that cycle again. From the crowd, a voice cut through the tension. "This some kind of joke?" Eddie's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing toward the source of the voice. A man in his 40s stood near the curb, his expression lined with doubt and something close to contempt. "He didn't ask for a job interview," the man continued. "He asked for a damn $1, a cup of coffee. You really think a guy living on the streets can just show up to work like that?" Vance, however, didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze head-on. "You tell me," he said, turning back to Eddie. Eddie's throat felt dry. His fingers curled into his sleeves, gripping the fabric as if trying to ground himself. The man with the grocery bag scoffed, shifting the weight of it from one arm to the other. "I've seen guys like you 100 times," the man muttered. "Always an excuse, always a reason why something ain't good enough." Eddie clenched his jaw. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Man, you don't know a damn thing about me." The guy let out a dry laugh. "I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're out here begging instead of trying. And I know you ain't about to take that offer." The words stung more than Eddie wanted to admit. He wanted to tell the guy to shove it, to walk away and forget this whole encounter ever happened. But the truth was, a small part of him did wonder, was he capable of taking this chance? Of following through? He turned back to Vance, his expression unreadable. "And what happens if this is bullshit?" His voice was quieter now, edged with something dangerously close to hope. "If I show up and they got nothing for me?" Vance didn't blink. "Then you call me." Eddie frowned. "Call you?" Vance nodded and pulled something else from his coat pocket. This time it wasn't another folded piece of paper, it was a small black flip phone. A burner. Simple. "Now you do." The crowd fell silent. A few gasps. Someone muttered, "No way." Eddie stared at the phone like it was something foreign, something that didn't belong in his hands. His breathing was uneven. No one had ever done something like this for him before. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. This was too much, too real. It scared the hell out of him. He had spent so long being invisible, being ignored, that the idea of someone actually giving him a way out felt almost too much to believe. Vance, however, didn't react to the accusation. He remained calm, his voice steady. "What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me." The question was directed at Eddie. His mouth felt dry. He looked down at the phone in his hand, its weight unfamiliar but grounding. "I guess," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "I make a call." It was the smallest commitment he could give. A first step, nothing more. Vance nodded. "That's all you gotta do." Eddie shifted his weight, his grip tightening around the phone. He wasn't sure if this would change anything. He wasn't sure if this was another false hope or the real thing. But for the first time in a long time, he had something. A name, a number, a phone, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Eddie stood there, the phone still in his hand, as the moments stretched between him and JD Vance. He had asked for $1, a single, simple request. Instead, he was being handed something far heavier, something far more complicated. The weight of the small black flip phone felt foreign in his palm. It wasn't just an object. It was a commitment. The crowd, now fully invested in the exchange, seemed to hold its collective breath. Some were waiting for Eddie to throw the phone back, to scoff at the offer and walk away. Others hoped, perhaps naively, that this was the kind of moment where things changed, where a man down on his luck reached out and grabbed hold of something solid. Eddie clenched his jaw, eyes flicking up to Vance. The man was calm, steady. He wasn't pleading, wasn't forcing anything on him. He had simply placed the opportunity on the table and was now waiting to see what Eddie would do with it. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "You really think a job is going to fix everything?" The man who had spoken was older, his salt and pepper beard giving him a hardened look. His arms were crossed, his posture defensive. Eddie recognized that stance. It was the posture of someone who had seen too much disappointment, who had learned to assume the worst. Vance didn't respond right away. He let the question hang in the air. "No," he finally said. "It won't fix everything." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The older man scoffed, shaking his head. "Then what's the point?" Eddie shifted on his feet, fingers tightening around the phone. He understood the question better than anyone. What was the point? A job wouldn't erase the years he had spent on the street. It wouldn't undo the nights he had gone hungry or the mornings he had woken up in an alley, aching from the cold. It wouldn't erase the feeling of being invisible, but maybe, just maybe, it could be a start. He exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had spent years telling himself that people like him didn't get second chances, that once you fell far enough there was no climbing back up. But now, someone was standing in front of him, saying otherwise. He looked back at Vance. "And if I screw it up?" His voice was quiet, but there was something raw in it, a question he had never dared to ask before. Vance met his gaze. "Then you try again." It was a simple answer. Too simple. Eddie wanted to believe it, but belief had never come easy to him. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of all the eyes on him. The crowd had grown, their interest lingering. Some held their phones up, capturing the moment. Others watched with skepticism, waiting to see if this was just another feel-good story that would amount to nothing. Eddie let out a slow breath. He wanted to walk away. That would be easier. No expectations, no risks. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was the way Vance wasn't pushing him, wasn't treating him like a problem to be solved. Maybe it was the quiet conviction in his voice. Or maybe deep down, Eddie was just tired. Tired of waking up and knowing that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. He stuffed the phone into his pocket. The movement was small, but it felt monumental. A first step. A maybe. The crowd reacted in different ways. Some murmured with approval, nodding slightly as if this was the ending they had hoped for. Others scoffed, unimpressed. The older man with the beard shook his head. "Who won't make it?" he muttered. Eddie's spine stiffened, but he didn't turn to face the man. He had heard those words before. Hell, he had told himself the same thing more times than he could count. But now, for the first time in a long time, he had a reason to prove himself wrong. Vance didn't press him further. He simply nodded, as if to say, "It's your choice now." And that was the truth of it. No grand promises, no guarantees. Just a choice. Eddie took another breath, steadied himself, and without another word, he walked away. The crowd slowly dispersed, their murmurs fading into the city noise. Some walked away shaking their heads, unconvinced that anything had truly changed. Others lingered for a few moments longer, glancing at Vance as if expecting him to say something grand, to declare some kind of victory. But he didn't. There was no dramatic ending, no certainty about what would happen next. Just a man who had extended a hand and another who had hesitantly chosen to reach for it. And that perhaps was the most important part, because change doesn't happen in a single moment. It doesn't come wrapped in a perfect story with a guaranteed outcome. Sometimes it's just the act of planting a seed, an offer, a choice, a chance. Maybe Eddie would make the call. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he would walk into that job and find himself again, proving the doubters wrong. Or maybe he'd get scared, stumble, and fall back into old patterns. But that wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in a long time, Eddie had been seen, not as a problem, not as a lost cause, but as a man still capable of standing up and trying again. And that's something we often forget. It's easy to look at people like Eddie and assume they're too far gone, that they've made too many mistakes, that they don't want to be helped. But what if the truth is simpler? What if all it takes is one person to believe in them, to remind them that they are still worth something? Not every opportunity comes in the form we expect. Some don't come at all. But when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't taking the help. It's believing you deserve it. What do you think? Have you ever had a second chance in life? Drop a comment below and share your story. Because sometimes, knowing someone else made it through is all the hope a person needs. And if this story made you think, share it. You never know who might need to hear it today.